My name is Renata, and I was 31 years old when my father looked me in the eye and told me I was no longer his daughter. Not because I had done something cruel. Not because I had hurt anyone. Because of who I had chosen to love. His exact words were, "If you walk out of this house and marry that man, you walk out of this family. We are done." I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not right there in front of him. I picked up my bag from the chair by the door and I walked out. Marcus was waiting in the car. I got in. He looked at me for a moment, didn't ask anything I wasn't ready to answer, and drove us home. There was something I hadn't told my parents yet. Something I hadn't told almost anyone. Marcus had never asked me to keep it quiet. It just never came up, and neither of us saw a reason to make a point of it. But there was a document. There was a building with his name attached to it. And 8 months later, in a room full of 400 people, my parents would walk through a set of doors and read a program that would tell them everything I hadn't. I want to tell you what happened in that room. But first, let me tell you how we got there. Welcome back to Last Regret, where quiet people let the room say what they never had to. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. New stories go up every week, and you won't want to miss what's coming. Drop a comment below, and tell me what you thought of this one. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with a gala. It doesn't start with a program or a plaque or a room full of people going quiet all at once. It starts in a much smaller place, a Sunday dinner table, a bowl of bread rolls going stale at the center, and my mother asking me, in her particular tone, whether I had thought this through. I had thought it through. I had been thinking it through for 2 years. My name is Renata Vasquez. I grew up in Meridian Hills, which is one of those neighborhoods that has a name specifically, so the people who live there can say it. My father, Gerald Vasquez, built a mid-sized commercial real estate firm over about 30 years. Not a dynasty, but comfortable. Well, past comfortable, if we're being honest. The kind of comfortable where my sister Claudia and I grew up with private school uniforms and summer weeks at a lake house, and the unspoken understanding that the people we eventually brought home would need to clear a certain bar. The bar was never written down. It didn't have to be. I was the older daughter, the one who, according to my father, had the head for it. I went to a 4-year university on partial scholarship. My parents covered the rest, studied urban planning, graduated without distinction in any direction, and came back to Meridian Hills to work for a regional nonprofit that focused on affordable housing development. The salary was modest. My father found this charming in the way people find a child's drawing charming, sweet, harmless, something she'll grow out of. I didn't grow out of it. I was 30 years old, I had been at that nonprofit for 6 years, and I had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city specifically because it was close to the communities I was working in. My father called it slumming. I called it doing my job. That's where I met Marcus. He was the building maintenance supervisor for a mixed-use property 3 blocks from my office, a complex that included a community center our organization used for outreach events. I had called the property management line twice about a broken exterior light in the parking lot and both times gotten voicemail. The third time, I walked over in person and asked for whoever was responsible for the building. Someone pointed me toward a man in a gray work shirt crouching next to an HVAC unit on the far side of the lot, writing something on a clipboard. I introduced myself. I explained the light. He listened without interrupting, nodded, and said he'd have it fixed by end of day. His name was Marcus Webb. He had calm eyes and the kind of deliberate way of speaking that made you feel like he was actually listening, not just waiting for you to finish. The light was fixed by 3 o'clock. I ran into him again 2 weeks later at a neighborhood planning meeting, one of those unglamorous Tuesday evening sessions where a city planner presents a rezoning proposal and 7 or 8 community members ask pointed questions about parking and noise. Marcus was sitting in the second row. He asked a question about load-bearing infrastructure in the proposed renovation, specific, technical, not the kind of question you'd expect from someone who just wandered in. After the meeting, I asked him how he knew that much about structural specifications. He shrugged, said he picked up a few things. That was very Marcus. We started getting coffee after those meetings, then dinners. By the time I introduced him to my parents, 14 months after we met, 3 months after I knew with certainty that I was going to marry this man, I had already learned enough to know that Marcus Webb was the most quietly competent person I had ever met in my life. What I hadn't done, what neither of us had thought to do, was explain that in detail to my parents before I brought him to Sunday dinner. In hindsight, I understand why the evening went the way it did. My father had a picture in his mind. Marcus showed up to that dinner in clean dark jeans and a simple button-down, drove a 6-year-old truck, spoke carefully and without embellishment, and when my father asked him what he did for work, he said he worked in building maintenance and facilities management. Which was true. It was entirely true. My father heard janitor, and the picture in his mind became a wall. Dinner was polite the way a dental appointment is polite. My mother asked Marcus questions about his family and nodded at his answers. My father talked mostly about the firm, about a new commercial development going up on the west side. Marcus listened. He didn't try to impress anyone, didn't name drop, didn't perform. That was also very Marcus. He didn't feel the need to be impressive in rooms where he hadn't been asked for anything. When Marcus and I left that evening, my father walked us to the door and shook Marcus's hand, brief, formal, the handshake of a man who has already made up his mind. On the front steps, out of earshot, my father said to me, "He seems like a decent enough person." And I remember thinking, that's not the same thing as approval. It wasn't. Over the following 3 months, as Marcus and I moved toward an engagement, my parents' concerns became less diplomatic. My mother would call me on weekday mornings, ostensibly to chat, and work her way around to questions about long-term stability and what his plans are. My father was more direct. At a family dinner in February, with my sister Claudia and her husband present, he said, not unkindly but clearly, "Renata, I want you to be practical about this. A man in his position isn't going to be able to give you the kind of life you were raised in." I said, "I'm not asking him to." My father looked at me for a moment. "Then what exactly are you asking for?" I said, "To be happy." He nodded slowly in the way that means the conversation is over, but nothing has been resolved. When Marcus proposed, a quiet evening, his apartment, no audience, I said yes before he finished the sentence. We were engaged in late March. We told my parents the following weekend. My mother's response was to go very still and ask when we were thinking. My father asked me to come speak with him in his study before we left. He closed the door. He stood by his desk rather than sitting down, which I had learned over my lifetime meant he had already decided what he was going to say and did not want to be in a position that suggested negotiation. He said, "I want you to take some time before you make this permanent. I'm asking you, as your father, to wait 6 months. Think about what you're doing." I said, "I've thought about it." "Then think harder," he said. "This man cannot provide for you. Not the way this family does. Not the way you deserve." I said, "Marcus isn't asking you to provide for me. And neither am I." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, "If you go through with this, Renata, I need you to understand that we are done. This family has a standard. He doesn't meet it, and I won't pretend otherwise." I said, "I understand." I picked up my bag. I walked out of the study, through the living room where my mother was sitting very straight on the sofa, and through the front door. Marcus was parked at the curb. I got in. He looked at me. He didn't ask immediately. We drove 2 blocks in silence, and then he said, quietly, "What happened?" I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want to go home?" I said yes. He drove us home. We were married 6 weeks later in a small civil ceremony. My officiant was a retired family court judge named Patricia Okonkwo, who had known Marcus for years and cried 3 times during the 20-minute service. My witness was my colleague Dana, who brought flowers she'd wrapped herself. Marcus's witnesses were 2 men I had met only a handful of times. Both of them, I would later understand, long-standing associates of his in the construction and development world, men who had driven several hours to be present and said nothing about it. Claudia did not come. I hadn't expected her to. She was 7 months pregnant, and the ceremony was a 2-hour drive, but she sent a card that said, simply, "I love you both." My parents did not acknowledge it at all. That was in early May. By the following January, Marcus and I had settled into a life that was quiet and full and nothing at all like what my parents had predicted. We lived in the East Side apartment for another 4 months before moving into a house, a solid, older craftsman on a wide lot, that Marcus had owned outright for 3 years. He'd bought it during a period when the neighborhood was undervalued, he said. He'd done most of the renovation work himself, on weekends, over about 18 months. I had visited that house once before we married and told him it was beautiful, and it was. Exposed beam ceiling in the living room, a kitchen with good light, a backyard with a vegetable garden that he tended with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. I asked him once, not long after we moved in, why he had never mentioned owning the house during all those months of courtship. He thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "You never asked about property. You asked about what I cared about." Those felt like different conversations. That was the thing about Marcus Webb. He answered the question you asked. He didn't volunteer the rest. There was a great deal of the rest. I learned it in pieces, mostly by accident. I would find a folder of site plans on the kitchen table, a voicemail from a structural engineer, a meeting request from someone with a title I recognized from my own work, a director at the Regional Development Authority. I didn't pry. Marcus wasn't secretive. He was just not a person who led with his resume. When I asked, he answered. Fully, clearly, without drama. What emerged from those conversations, assembled gradually over the first 8 months of our marriage, was this. Marcus Webb had, at the age of 22, started a small facilities management company with a $14,000 business loan and 2 employees, himself and a cousin. He had grown it steadily, without fanfare, into a mid-sized commercial and civic construction management firm. He had, over 15 years, overseen the construction or renovation of 11 public-use buildings in our region, community centers, a public library branch, a workforce training facility. His firm employed 43 people. His name was not on the side of his truck. It was not on his business cards, which were plain white with black text, and listed only a job title and a phone number. He was not invisible in the industry. People in that world knew exactly who he was, but he had never been the kind of person who needed anyone outside that world to know, including my parents. The one thing he had been working on quietly for almost 2 years before we met was the City Arts Center project. A new civic building, performance space, gallery, community programming rooms, designed to anchor a redevelopment corridor on the city's south end. The project had been in planning for years, caught in funding gaps and political delays. Marcus's firm had been brought in as construction manager, and Marcus, personally, had pledged a founding gift to the private campaign that closed the final funding gap. I knew about the pledge. I knew the amount. He had told me matter-of-factly one evening when I asked about a document on the kitchen table, a campaign acknowledgement letter from the Arts Center Foundation. The amount was $430,000. I looked at the letter for a moment. I said, "Marcus." He said, "It was the right project. The South End needed it." I said, "Does my father know any of this?" He said, "No one asked me about it." I thought about that for a long time. The gala was scheduled for the second Saturday of January. It was the grand opening of the Art Center, the public celebration of a building that had been 3 years in planning and 14 months in construction. The foundation had organized the evening as a fundraising gala, 400 invited guests, a program, a dedication ceremony, dinner. Tickets were not cheap. The room would include city council members, the regional development director, corporate donors, architects, contractors, and a significant portion of the civic and philanthropic leadership of our city. My father had bought 2 tickets. I found this out approximately 3 weeks before the event, through a route I did not expect. Dana, my colleague, whose organization had received a small grant from the Art Center Foundation and had been invited as part of the community partner table. She mentioned, in passing, that she had seen my parents' names on the guest list. My father's firm had a minor stake in a retail development adjacent to the new building, and the foundation had extended an invitation. I told Marcus that evening. He nodded. He didn't look surprised exactly. He looked like someone who had considered this possibility and filed it without alarm. I said, "Do you want to talk about it?" He said, "Is there something to talk about?" I thought about it. I said, "No." He said, "Then we'll just go." We arrived at the Arts Center at 7 in the evening. Marcus wore a dark suit, one of two he owned, both of which fit him perfectly and which he treated the same way he treated everything, without ceremony. I wore a dress I had bought in November, dark green, simple. We checked in at the welcome table. The volunteer handed us each a program. I had seen a draft of the program. I knew what was in it, but holding the final printed version, thick paper stock, the building on the cover, and knowing that 400 other people in that room were opening it or would open it, and that 2 of those people were my parents, and that my mother would probably flip to the donor acknowledgments within the first 10 minutes because that was simply what my mother did at these kinds of events. I felt something move through my chest that I would not call nerves, exactly. More like the particular stillness that comes just before something that cannot be undone. Marcus put his hand on the small of my back, briefly. He said, "You want a drink before we find our table?" I said, "Yes." We went to the bar. We were at our table, round, white linen, near the middle of the room, for approximately 20 minutes before I saw my parents arrive. My father in a dark suit, my mother in a navy dress I recognized from a benefit they had attended 2 years prior. They were with another couple I didn't know. They checked in at the welcome table. The volunteer handed them programs. My mother opened hers immediately. I watched her the way you watch something from a distance when you already know what's going to happen but you still cannot look away. She flipped past the welcome page, past the building notes, past the architect's statement. She reached the acknowledgement section. I knew the page. I knew the layout. Bold header, founding donors. And at the top, first alphabetically, with the gift amount listed in the column to the right. Web Community Foundation, $430,000. My mother went still. Not the polite dinner, kind of still. A different kind, the kind where the body simply stops because the mind has just encountered something that requires reprocessing. She looked at the page. She looked up. She looked across the room with a particular attention, the way someone looks when they're searching for something they're not sure they want to find. She found us. Our eyes met across roughly 40 feet of white-clothed tables and candlelight and the noise of 400 people at a gala. Her expression did not rearrange itself into anything I recognized. It was just open, unguarded in a way I had almost never seen on my mother's face. She touched my father's arm, quietly, the way you touch someone when you don't want to make a scene. He looked at her. She showed him the page. I watched my father read it. His jaw tightened. That was the only movement, just that one small tightening, the kind that happens when a person is doing the work of keeping their face neutral, while something internal recalibrates entirely. He looked up from the program. He looked toward our table. He saw Marcus. Marcus was speaking with a man to his left, a contractor named Pete who had worked on 3 of Marcus's projects and who was telling a story involving a structural inspection that had apparently gone very sideways. Marcus was listening with the slight smile he gets when a story is going somewhere good. He was not watching my parents. He was not performing anything. He was just sitting at a table at a gala named after a building his company had built, in a room that had cost him $430,000 to help bring into existence, having a pleasant conversation about structural inspections. My father set the program down on the table in front of him very carefully, the way you set something down when you're being deliberate about not making noise. The dedication ceremony began at 8. The foundation director took the podium, welcomed the guests, spoke about the building's history and the years of work that had brought it to completion. She thanked the architectural team. She thanked the construction management firm, Web Construction Management, she said, whose precision and commitment had kept the project on schedule through 2 winters and a material shortage that would have derailed a less experienced team. 400 people applauded. She then moved to the founding donors. She named them in order, inviting each to stand briefly for acknowledgement. When she said, Marcus Webb, Web Community Foundation, whose founding gift of $430,000 made the final phase of this project possible, Marcus stood. He didn't say anything. He nodded once, the way he nods when someone thanks him for something he considers ordinary. He sat back down. Pete, beside him, clapped him on the shoulder. I looked at my parents' table. My father was sitting very straight. My mother had her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she was looking at Marcus with an expression that I can only describe as reckoning, the look of someone doing arithmetic that is coming out wrong. After the ceremony, during dinner service, I was approached by the foundation director, who shook my hand and thanked me warmly and said that Marcus's gift had come at a moment when the campaign had genuinely stalled and that without it, the building might have been delayed another 18 months. She said this to me as his wife, as a matter of fact, the way you say things to the family of someone who has done something real. I thanked her. I meant it. My parents made their way to our table approximately 40 minutes later, during the dessert course, while Marcus was away briefly speaking with a city council member near the back of the room. My father came first, my mother slightly behind him. He stopped at the edge of our table. He looked at me. He said, "Renata." I said, "Hi, Dad." He said, "We didn't know." I said, "I know." He looked toward where Marcus was standing. He said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about that for a moment. I said, "You didn't ask about him. You asked about what he drove." My mother made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. My father looked at the table. He said, "We handled this badly." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'd like to. I think we should talk. All of us. If Marcus is willing." I said, "That would be his decision to make." Marcus came back to the table about 5 minutes later. He looked at my parents. He looked at me. He pulled out his chair and sat down without any particular change in his expression, and he said, in the same tone he uses for everything, "Gerald, Carol, good evening." My father said, "Marcus, I owe you an apology." Marcus said, "I appreciate that." He picked up his coffee. He said, "This is a good building." The acoustics in the main hall came out better than the models predicted. And then he turned slightly to include my father in the conversation, and he began talking about the acoustic engineering, and my father, after a moment, leaned forward slightly in his chair, and I watched my father listen to my husband the way he listened to people he respected. That was the evening. Not a scene. Not a confrontation. 400 people and a program and a building and a coffee cup, and my husband talking about acoustic panels as though none of the last 8 months had happened, and my father leaning forward in his chair. I want to tell you what came after, because this story doesn't end at the gala. Not for me, anyway. The call came the following morning. My mother, at 8:30, which was early for her. She did not launch into the subject immediately. She asked how I had slept. She asked about the drive home. And then she said, "I want to understand something. All those months, did you know? About everything?" I said, "I learned it in pieces. He's not someone who announces himself." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Your father was up until midnight." I said, "I know this is a lot to process." She said, "It's not the money, Renata. I need you to understand that. It's not. It wasn't supposed to be about the money." I said, "I know what it was about." She said, "I'm sorry." I believed her. My mother is not an easy person to believe when she apologizes because she doesn't do it often, and when she does, it tends to come out formal and slightly stiff, like a letter written by committee. But this one was just quiet. She said it the way you say something when you mean it, and you know it won't fix anything, but you also know it needed to be said. I said, "I hear you." My father called 2 days later. His apology was longer and more structured. He had clearly thought about what he wanted to say, which was very him. He said he had been wrong to issue an ultimatum. He said he had let his assumptions about what Marcus was tell him something about who Marcus was, and those were not the same thing, and he should have known better. He said he would like to have us over for dinner if we were willing. I said I would talk to Marcus. Marcus's response when I told him was, "Sure. When are they thinking?" That was also very Marcus. I will tell you something about the months that followed, because I think it matters. My parents did not suddenly become different people. My father still had a way of steering conversations towards subjects he was confident in, still had opinions about the restaurant choices and the neighborhood and the long-term plan. My mother still had her particular silences that said more than she intended. None of that evaporated. But something shifted, some fundamental recalibration in the way my father sat across a dinner table for Marcus. He listened differently. He asked questions that were real questions, not tests. He He stopped talking about what Marcus should be doing and started asking what Marcus was doing. The last time I saw them, a dinner at their house in the spring, my father spent 40 minutes asking Marcus about a public transit corridor development that Marcus's firm had been brought in to consult on. My mother refilled Marcus's coffee without being asked and told me afterward on the phone that she thought he was very sharp. I told Marcus what she said. He said, "That's nice of her." I said, "It took her 8 months and a Gala program to get there." He said, "People move when they move." That is the thing I want you to sit with. Not the Gala. Not the program or the plaque or the number in the acknowledgements column. Those things were just a building. The thing I want you to sit with is this. Marcus never needed my parents to know. He never laid the groundwork for a reveal. He never waited for the right moment to announce himself. He just kept doing the work he had always done in the way he had always done it, and when the room eventually showed my parents who he was, he accepted their apology, talked about acoustic panels, and drank his coffee. I married a man who cleans up after himself. In every sense of the phrase. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be seen by rooms that don't have eyes for them. Marcus already knew who he was. He didn't need the room to confirm it. That's my story. A gray work shirt, a program on a white tablecloth, and a building with better acoustics than the models predicted. If you were in that gala and you watched my father read that program, would you have said something or let the room handle it? Drop your answer in the comments. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.